His statement from Montecito landed in London at precisely 7 a.m., timed to coincide with the morning news cycle and calculated to ensure maximum impact across international media markets. Harry and Meghan had learned the art of strategic communication from their years within the royal system, and now they deployed those skills with the precision of experienced professionals who understood exactly how to shape a global narrative. The words were carefully chosen, each sentence crafted to convey both hurt and determination while maintaining the dignity that royal training had instilled in them. But, beneath the diplomatic language lay an unmistakable message: they would not be silenced, controlled, or diminished by an institution that had already rejected them. "We are disappointed that the king has chosen to make our private family matters public through official channels," the statement began, immediately reframing the narrative from royal authority to family dysfunction. "We have always sought to build our independent careers with integrity and authenticity, guided by the same values of service that we learned as working members of the royal family." At Buckingham Palace, the king's private secretary delivered the news with the careful neutrality that palace staff had perfected over centuries of delivering unwelcome information to monarchs. King Charles read the statement twice, his expression growing more grave with each word. "They're not backing down," he said to William, who had arrived early to discuss crisis management strategies. "In fact, they're escalating." William scanned the statement with the analytical mind that had been trained to see political implications in every public communication. "They're positioning this as family persecution rather than institutional protection." "That's quite clever, actually." "Clever and damaging," Charles replied, already envisioning the news cycles, opinion pieces, and social media debates that would follow. "They're making this about personal relationships rather than proper protocol." But, the statement continued with words that cut deeper than political strategy: "We have never sought to diminish the monarchy or undermine the important work of the royal family. We have simply asked for the space to serve others in our own way, using our experiences and platforms to address issues we care deeply about. It is painful to see these efforts characterized as threats to an institution we still respect and love." The carefully constructed language masked a raw emotional truth that resonated far beyond royal circles. Here was a son publicly declaring his continued love for a family that seemed determined to push him away, a daughter-in-law expressing respect for an institution that had never fully accepted her, and two people asking for nothing more than the freedom to build meaningful lives on their own terms. Social media exploded within hours. #StandWithHarry and Meghan began trending worldwide, joined by counter hashtags supporting the king's position. Royal watchers, constitutional experts, and armchair psychologists offered endless analysis of what the conflict meant for the monarchy, the Commonwealth, and the modern world's relationship with traditional institutions. In California, Meghan watched the global response unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. They had succeeded in reframing the narrative, but success came at the cost of yet another public airing of family grievances that she had hoped to leave behind when they moved to America. "Look at this," she said to Harry, showing him a particularly supportive editorial from a major American newspaper. "They're calling your father's statement tone-deaf authoritarianism and questioning whether the monarchy can survive in the modern world." Harry felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness. He had wanted his family to understand his position, not to see the institution itself called into question. But years of feeling unheard had left him with little patience for protecting the very system that seemed determined to silence him. "Maybe that's a conversation the world needs to have," he replied, though his voice carried the weight of someone who understood he was contributing to the potential downfall of something his grandmother had spent 70 years building. The afternoon brought news that several major Commonwealth countries were issuing statements about the importance of modernizing royal relationships with former colonial territories. Prime ministers who had remained diplomatically neutral on family matters suddenly found themselves answering questions about whether ancient institutions could adapt to contemporary values of independence and equality. "This is spiraling beyond family dynamics," observed their communications director during an emergency strategy session. "We're now at the center of a global debate about monarchy itself." Meghan had spent years being blamed for every criticism of royal traditions, and she recognized the familiar pattern of personal conflicts becoming symbols of larger cultural tensions. "We didn't start this fight," she reminded the room. "We've been trying to avoid it for years. But we're definitely winning it," added their legal counsel, reviewing early polling data that showed overwhelming public support for Harry and Meghan's position. The King's statement has backfired spectacularly in terms of public opinion. At Buckingham Palace, similar conversations were happening with very different conclusions. Palace advisors who had counseled a strong response to Harry and Meghan's commercial activities now found themselves managing a public relations disaster that threatened to damage the monarchy's reputation across multiple continents. The Commonwealth representatives are asking for clarification on the monarchy's position regarding independence and self-determination, reported the palace's head of communications. They're drawing parallels between the King's treatment of Harry and historical colonial attitudes. Charles felt the conversation slipping away from family matters into dangerous territory that touched on the monarchy's relationship with former colonies, contemporary relevance, and fundamental questions about inherited power in democratic societies. "We need to contain this," he told his advisors. This was supposed to be about business practices, not constitutional politics. But containment proved impossible when the story had already evolved beyond royal family dynamics into broader questions about authority, independence, and the right of individuals to define their own relationship with inherited institutions. Opinion polls showed declining support for the monarchy in several key countries, with younger demographics particularly critical of what they saw as an old-fashioned attempt to control family members who had already chosen independence. The irony, observed a constitutional expert on the BBC Evening News, is that by trying to control Harry and Meghan's independence, the King has sparked a much larger conversation about the monarchy's own independence from democratic accountability. Back in Montecito, Harry and Meghan watched the global response with growing awareness that their personal family conflict had become something much larger and more consequential than either side had intended. "We wanted the right to tell our own story," Meghan reflected as they prepared for bed, "but now our story is being told by everyone." Harry nodded, understanding that they had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. "Maybe that was always going to happen eventually. Maybe we just forced the conversation that was already building." As the day ended, both California and London faced the reality that a family disagreement had evolved into an international incident with implications that none of the participants had fully anticipated. The King's attempt to establish control had sparked questions about the very foundation of royal authority, while Harry and Meghan's quest for independence had become a symbol for broader conversations about individual rights versus institutional demands. Neither side had achieved what they originally sought. Charles had not gained control over his son's commercial activities, and Harry had not secured the peaceful independence he craved. Instead, they had jointly created a crisis that would reshape public understanding of the monarchy for generations to come. The final irony was that in trying to protect the institution from criticism, the King had sparked the most serious challenge to royal authority in decades. And, in seeking freedom from royal constraints, Harry and Meghan had become more closely identified with royal controversies than ever before. As morning approached in London and evening settled over California, both father and son faced the sobering reality that some conflicts, once made public, take on lives of their own that no royal authority can control. The question now was not who would win this particular battle, but whether the monarchy itself could survive the larger war of ideas that their family conflict had unleashed upon the world. California's sunshine streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Montecito mansion as Meghan Markle moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to guard precious moments of normalcy. At 42, she had discovered that royal titles followed you across oceans, but so did the complications they brought. Harry sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone while sipping coffee from a mug that read "World's Greatest Dad," a gift from their children that seemed almost absurdly normal given the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. The morning news played softly in the background, a habit they had maintained despite trying to distance themselves from the constant coverage of their former royal existence. "Anything interesting happening in the world?" Meghan asked, though she had learned to dread the answer to that question. Their attempts to build a peaceful life in California had been repeatedly interrupted by waves of media attention, family drama, and business decisions that somehow became international news. "The usual," Harry replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. His phone had been buzzing more than usual, messages from numbers he recognized as palace contacts, journalists, and family friends who typically only reached out when something significant was brewing. Meghan noticed the tension in his shoulders, the slight crease between his eyebrows that appeared whenever royal family matters intruded on their carefully constructed new life. For years had passed since they stepped back from working royal duties, but the emotional distance from his family seemed to grow wider rather than narrower with each passing month. Their production company, Archwell Productions, had been gaining momentum with projects that reflected their values and interests. The documentaries they produced focused on mental health, social justice, and stories of resilience that rarely made headlines but changed individual lives. It was meaningful work that felt authentic in ways that royal ribbon-cutting ceremonies never had. But success brought its own complications. Every project was scrutinized for royal connections, every interview analyzed for hints about family relationships, every business decision evaluated through the lens of their former royal status. They had wanted independence but discovered that royal titles were like shadows, impossible to escape even under the brightest California sun. "We should probably call the lawyers this morning," Meghan said, sensing something in Harry's demeanor that suggested more than routine morning emails. "Is there something specific happening?" Before Harry could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized, Palace Communications, calling from London where the afternoon was already well underway. He glanced at Meghan, who had learned to read the subtle signs that meant their quiet morning was about to become something else entirely. "Your Royal Highness," the voice on the other end was formal, professional, and careful in ways that immediately put Harry on alert. "I'm calling to inform you that His Majesty will be releasing a statement this morning regarding commercial activities and royal titles." Harry felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied any communication from the palace. Years of therapy had helped him understand these physical responses to family stress, but understanding didn't make them less intense when they arrived. "What kind of statement?" he asked, though part of him already knew this wouldn't be good news. "The King has decided to formally request that you and the Duchess cease all commercial activities that reference royal titles or trade on royal connections." The words hit like cold water. Harry's mind raced through the implications: their production deals, speaking engagements, charitable foundation work, all of it touched in some way by their royal background. It wasn't that they deliberately traded on royal connections, but those connections were part of their story, part of what made their voices relevant in conversations about mental health, social justice, and institutional change. "I see," Harry managed, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "And if we don't agree to these terms?" The statement indicates that further action may be considered necessary to protect the integrity of the institution. After ending the call, Harry sat in silence for several moments while Meghan watched his face cycle through emotions she had seen too many times before. The hurt was always first, the wounded expression of someone whose family continued to choose institution over relationship. Then came anger, righteous and burning, followed by the kind of determination that had carried him through military service and humanitarian work. "They want us to stop all our commercial work," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Anything that references our royal background or titles." Meghan felt her own anger rising, the protective instinct that had driven so many of their decisions since leaving royal life. "Our titles are part of who we are. We can't just pretend we were never part of the royal family." Apparently, that's exactly what they want us to do. The morning had shifted from peaceful to combative in the span of a single phone call. Meghan began pacing, her mind already working through the implications for their various projects, their team, the people who depended on their work for their own livelihoods. "This is about control," she said, articulating what they both understood. "They can't accept that we found a way to be successful without their permission." Harry nodded, but his expression carried layers of pain that went beyond business considerations. This felt like another rejection from a family that had never quite figured out how to love him without requiring complete submission to royal expectations. "What about the Netflix series?" Meghan asked, referring to their upcoming documentary project about mental health in military families. "What about the foundation work? Are we supposed to pretend we don't have insight into these issues because of our experiences?" According to my father, yes. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had left royal life partly to have the freedom to speak authentically about issues they cared about, only to be told that their authenticity itself was now considered a threat to the institution they had left behind. Meghan's phone began ringing, their publicist, then their lawyer, then their business manager. Word was already spreading through the networks of people who made their independent life possible. Each call brought more questions they couldn't yet answer, more decisions that would need to be made quickly and carefully. "We need to think about this strategically," Meghan said, falling back on the skills that had served her well as an actress, activist, and, eventually, as someone navigating the impossible terrain of royal family dynamics. "We can't just react emotionally." But, even as she spoke, Harry was already drafting a response in his mind. Years of feeling silenced, of watching his truth be filtered through palace communication strategies, had left him with a deep need to speak for himself when family conflicts became public battles. "They don't get to define our story anymore," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally learned the difference between duty and submission. "We've built something real here, something that helps people. I won't let them destroy that to protect their own image." Meghan recognized the tone. It was the same voice Harry used when talking about his military service, his charity work, the parts of his life that connected to his deepest sense of purpose. This wasn't just about business deals or public relations strategies. This was about identity, autonomy, and the right to build a meaningful life outside the constraints of an institution that had never quite figured out how to accommodate his particular combination of royal duty and personal authenticity. "So we fight back?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "We tell the truth," Harry corrected. "We let people understand what's really happening here." The afternoon brought a parade of advisors, lawyers, and publicists to their home. Their quiet refuge became a strategy center as they worked through responses, implications, and next steps. The children played in the garden, blissfully unaware that their parents were being forced to choose between family peace and personal integrity yet again. By evening, Harry had drafted a statement that was both measured and unmistakably clear. They would not be silenced, would not pretend their royal background didn't exist, and would not accept limitations on their ability to build meaningful careers that happened to benefit from their unique perspectives and experiences. "Are you sure about this?" Meghan asked as they reviewed the final draft. "Once we release this, there's no going back." Harry looked out at the California landscape they had chosen as their new home, where their children could grow up with different expectations about duty, service, and the relationship between personal happiness and public obligation. "I've been going back my whole life," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to just go forward instead." As night fell over Montecito, half a world away from the palace where his father was probably having his own sleepless night, Harry prepared to send a statement that would turn a family disagreement into an international incident. But, for the first time in years, he felt the clarity that came with choosing his own truth over someone else's version of duty. The statement would be released in the morning, time to respond to his father's announcement with the kind of strategic thinking they had learned from years of royal communications training. But, unlike those carefully managed royal statements, this one would carry the unmistakable voice of someone who had finally stopped asking permission to be himself. The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood before the ornate mirror in his private chambers, adjusting his tie with the same careful precision he had maintained throughout his decades of royal duty. At 75, his weathered hands moved with practiced ease, but today carried a weight that seemed to press against his shoulders like an invisible crown. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, knocked gently before entering with the morning briefings. The usual stack of documents lay waiting, but Charles barely glanced at them. His mind was elsewhere, focused on a decision that had been brewing for months in the quiet corners of Buckingham Palace. "Your Majesty," Alderton began carefully, "the morning appointments are ready for your review. The Prime Minister expects your call at 10, and the Commonwealth representatives are scheduled for this afternoon." Charles nodded absently, his gaze drifting toward the window where the ancient oak tree swayed in the gentle breeze. Somewhere across the Atlantic, his youngest son Harry was probably just waking up in his Montecito home, unaware that this day would reshape their already strained relationship forever. The decision had been building for weeks. Reports from palace insiders suggested growing tensions between the working royals and the California-based couple. Meghan's recent interview comments about the monarchy's outdated traditions had particularly stung, not because of their boldness, but because they echoed criticisms Charles himself had privately harbored for decades. Yet what troubled the king most wasn't the criticism itself, but the growing divide it represented. Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties had been painful enough, but their continued public commentary felt like salt in wounds that had never properly healed. The palace staff whispered in corridors about leaked stories, competing narratives, and a family drama that played out under the relentless gaze of global media. William arrived at the castle shortly before noon, his usual composed demeanor masking the concern that had been eating at him for weeks. As heir to the throne, he understood better than most the delicate balance required to maintain the monarchy's relevance while honoring its traditions. The ongoing situation with Harry and Meghan threatened that balance in ways that kept him awake at night. "Father," William said as he entered the king's study, where Charles sat behind the massive mahogany desk that had served monarchs for generations. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week." Charles looked up from the documents spread before him, documents that would soon change everything. "About Harry and Meghan?" "About the future of the monarchy," William corrected gently. "About what we can and cannot tolerate in terms of public criticism and commercial ventures that trade on royal connections." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history surrounding them in the form of portraits depicting centuries of royal predecessors. Each face seemed to watch with judgment, as if questioning whether the current generation possessed the strength to preserve what previous kings and queens had built. "I've made a decision," Charles said finally, his voice carrying the authority that had been cultivated over a lifetime of preparation for this role. "It's time to take definitive action." William leaned forward, recognizing the tone his father used when royal duty demanded difficult choices. "What kind of action?" Charles reached for a sealed envelope that had been sitting on his desk since dawn. The palace letterhead bore the royal seal, and the weight of the paper itself seemed to carry the gravity of what lay inside. "I'm formally requesting that Harry and Meghan cease all commercial activities that reference their royal titles or connections." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before an ancient enemy. William's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, then to something approaching relief mixed with apprehension. "That's quite a strong position, Father." "It's a necessary position," Charles replied firmly. "We cannot have members of the royal family, even former working royals, conducting business ventures that capitalize on their connections to the crown while simultaneously criticizing the institution that granted them those very connections." The decision hadn't come easily. Charles remembered Harry as a young boy, full of mischief and laughter, bringing joy to a palace often weighed down by protocol and duty. That same boy had grown into a man who served his country with honor in Afghanistan, who championed causes close to his heart with genuine passion, and who had seemed to find happiness with Meghan in those early days. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. The fairy tale romance had given way to public accusations, tell-all interviews, and a seemingly endless stream of revelations that painted the royal family in increasingly unflattering light. Each new development felt like another crack in the foundation of an institution that had survived wars, scandals, and social upheaval for over 1,000 years. "What specifically are you requesting they cease?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Charles opened the envelope and withdrew several pages of formal correspondence. "All commercial partnerships that reference their royal titles. The production deals that explicitly trade on their insider knowledge of royal life. The speaking engagements that position them as authorities on royal matters while maintaining their criticism of royal practices. And, if they refuse? Then, we'll be forced to consider more drastic measures." The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows as palace staff quietly went about their duties, unaware that their king was about to set in motion events that would dominate headlines around the world. In the kitchen, preparations began for the evening meal. In the gardens, groundskeepers tended to roses that had bloomed for queens and kings across centuries. Life continued with the same rhythms that had sustained the monarchy through triumph and crisis alike. But, in that study, father and son planned a confrontation that would test whether love and duty could coexist when public scrutiny turned family disagreements into international incidents. Charles thought about his own relationship with his parents, particularly the complex dynamics with his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. She had navigated her own family crises with a combination of private firmness and public silence that had generally served the monarchy well. But times had changed. Social media amplified every whisper, every gesture, every perceived slight into global conversations that could reshape public opinion in hours rather than years. The statement will be released tomorrow morning, Charles announced, his decision now final and irreversible. I've consulted with the Prime Minister's office and our legal team. This is both necessary and justified under the terms they agreed to when they stepped back from royal duties. William nodded, understanding that his father had crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. Have you considered how Harry might respond? I've considered how a son might respond, Charles said quietly. But we're beyond the luxury of purely personal considerations now. This is about the survival and integrity of the institution we're sworn to protect. As evening approached, the king walked alone through the castle's ancient corridors, past portraits of ancestors who had faced their own impossible choices. Some had chosen family over crown, others crown over family. All had paid prices that history would judge long after their personal pain had been forgotten. Tomorrow, the world would wake to news that King Charles III had drawn a line in the sand with his own son. The newspapers would analyze every word, every implication, every possible consequence. Royal watchers would debate whether this represented strength or weakness, wisdom or stubbornness. But tonight, in the quiet moments before the storm, Charles allowed himself to remember the young prince who had once brought him drawings from school, who had laughed at his jokes about architecture and gardening, who had seemed to understand the weight of royal duty even as a child. That prince still existed somewhere beneath the public accusations and private grievances. Charles held on to that hope even as he prepared to do what kings must do when duty demands the impossible sacrifice of putting crown before family, tradition before personal happiness, and the future of an ancient institution before the comfort of a father's love. The sealed letter sat on his bedside table, ready for morning delivery across an ocean to a son who might never forgive what was about to unfold. But forgiveness, Charles had learned, was a luxury that kings could rarely afford when the weight of history pressed down upon decisions that would echo through generations yet to come.